samples. So let's look at some questions here. So we've got briefly describe one specific historical difference between the United States reaction to the international events following the First World War and following the Second World War. So this is a comparison question because we're looking at difference. And then briefly describe a specific historical similarity. So again, tying into comparison between the two world wars. And then we want to come back to the difference. We want to come back to the difference and talk about the reason for the difference between them. And then in the second one that we're going to look at, briefly describe a development that contributed to the passage of New Deal legislation. If something contributes to something else, isn't that a cause? So again, think about what you're trying to do here. Then briefly explain one effect of the New Deal. So this is a causation question, but then they also sneak in a comparison with this one. Briefly explain one difference between the role of the federal government in the United States during the Gilded Age and the role of the federal government in the economy in the 1930s. All right, so I want us to look at these samples. And again, these are student samples that I'm bringing in to share with you. And let me remind you of the question here. So we've got the differences between the United States, differences between the United States reaction to the First World War and the Second World War. Looks like I need to focus a little bit better there. Come on, autofocus. One specific historical similarity and one difference. All right, let me try it this way. Okay. So if we look at our sample, that still looks blurry to me. There we go. All right, so if we look at the difference, in an SAQ, you want to answer what's being asked, then provide your example. All right, so look at my question here, describing a difference between the reaction of the United States after World War I and World War II. So here's what I've got. One difference between the U.S. reaction to events following World War I and World War II was the level of U.S. involvement in post-war international organizations. That's my answer. Now I've got to prove it. And so I need to have evidence of what they did after World War I and what they did after World War II. So although designed by President Wilson after World War I, the U.S. never joined the League of Nations and that was meant to resolve international disputes. So I need to define it. If I throw in that term, I need to define what it is. In contrast, notice what I've done there. So I've made it clear that this is showing a difference. In contrast, the U.S. did join the United Nations after World War II. And then I define it, an organization also intended to maintain world peace. So I've answered my question and I've got my evidence from both time periods. Then I want to get into a similarity for part B. So this would have earned a point here for A. One similarity between U.S. reaction to events following both world wars was the rise in the hunt for communists by the government in the United States. I need to prove it. So I need to show where they were hunting communists after World War I and after World War II. The Red Scare following World War I included events like the Palmer raids, in which the government conducted extensive searches for businesses for evidence of communist activity among the people. A similar rise in communist fears being investigated can be seen in the wide-ranging hearings to find communist spies by the House Committee on Un-American Activities, or you might have used one of the spy cases. Now, again, you may have totally different evidence, and that is okay. All right, this is just an example, and these are student samples that College Board has. All right, then the reason for the difference. So this is a little more difficult question. The reason for the difference of U.S. involvement in post-war international organizations was the perception of danger that the public believed existed in the United States. So after World War I, people didn't feel as much in danger as they did after World War II. Well, why is that? So following World War I, the U.S. retreated to a more isolated approach to foreign affairs, in some ways due to the negative report of businesses profiting off of the war effort by the Nye report. So they made these accusations that it was all this ploy for businesses to make money. And so people were like, why would we tie ourselves? We go back to our traditional approach. Americans were much more accepting of a larger role of international peacekeeping organizations after World War II because the U.S. mainland had experienced the attack at Pearl Harbor and there was greater fear of future harm. All right, so I hope that helps, seeing that you need to answer it, then provide your evidence. All right, the next question, we already looked at the questions, but let me remind you of them. We're talking about causes and effects of the New Deal and comparing it to the Gilded Age. All right, so if we look at my answer here, looking at the cause of the New Deal, the persistence of the Great Depression is what this student has said caused the New Deal. The persistence of the Great Depression due to failed efforts by President Hoover led to support for the New Deal programs. I need to prove why was there persistence in the New Deal. So President Hoover had supported measures that required voluntary action by businesses and limited government intervention. Okay, so now I've given my example, my evidence. Hoover didn't get involved in this. So now I've got to tie it back together because these failed to reduce unemployment and promote economic growth. Congress passed Roosevelt's New Deal legislation requiring more direct government relief. I've answered it. I've given my example, and then I've tied it back to prove my claim. All right, almost finished. So one effect of the New Deal. So this was a cause, here's an effect. An effect of the New Deal legislation was the federal government's growing transition to modern liberalism. We talked about that earlier today by establishing more social welfare programs. So I've got to prove that the effect here was that there was more social welfare and growing modern liberalism. One such program from the New Deal is the Social Security for retired Americans. So there's my example, but now I've got to explain, how does this show an effect? This shows how the New Deal changed the role of the federal government because they had previously relied on states, local government, and community charity to provide this level of support for individual welfare. Now the government's providing it. And then the last thing, I've got to provide a difference between this and the Gilded Age. We studied the Gilded Age last time I was with you in Unit 6. One difference between the Gilded Age and the 1930s government approach to economics is how much regulation was placed on business. So now I've got to make this comparison. I've got to show evidence from the Gilded Age and evidence from the 1930s. So during the Gilded Age, the government followed more of a laissez-faire approach, but I've got to define that with very little restriction on business, which resulted in large monopolies like Standard Oil. In contrast, so again, I'm showing that this is a difference. The government passed laws in the 1930s to regulate business competition and pay workers a minimum wage. So I think these students did a great job in answering